The gunshot that killed her father echoed through Grace Abbott's mind every single day, a relentless reminder that the world was filled with people who took what they wanted without mercy or conscience. She stood outside the general store in Independence, California, clutching her worn basket against her chest, watching the dusty street with eyes that had learned to trust no one. It was the spring of 1878, and the small mining town nestled in the eastern Sierra Nevada had become both her prison and her refuge since that terrible night 2 years ago, when everything she believed about human goodness had shattered like glass under a boot heel. Her father, Thomas Abbott, had been a kind merchant who extended credit to struggling families and never turned away anyone in need. That generosity had cost him his life when 3 drifters decided his till contained enough money to fund their next drinking spree. Grace had hidden behind the counter, 17 years old and trembling, listening to her father beg for his life while promising them every cent he had. They shot him anyway, laughing as they emptied the register of the meager $40 it contained. The sheriff caught 2 of them within a week, but the 3rd man vanished like smoke, and Grace learned that justice was as unreliable as human decency. The townspeople had been sympathetic at first, bringing casseroles and offering hollow condolences. But sympathy faded quickly when the creditors came calling. Her father's kindness had meant he was owed thousands of dollars by families who now claimed they couldn't remember the exact amounts, or insisted they had already paid. The store had to be sold to cover his debts, and Grace found herself working as a laundress and seamstress, taking in mending and washing for the very people who had conveniently forgotten what they owed her father. She lived in a tiny room behind the boarding house, her hands perpetually raw from lye soap, her heart encased in ice. She had learned to speak only when necessary, to keep her eyes down, to expect nothing from anyone. When Mrs. Henderson shortchanged her $3 for a month of washing, Grace said nothing. When Mr. Carlyle claimed she had ruined his best shirt and refused to pay at all, she swallowed her protests. When the banker's wife spread rumors that Grace was stealing from clotheslines to supplement her income, she endured the suspicious glances without defending herself. What was the point? People believed what they wanted to believe, and in Grace's experience, they generally believed the worst. She was preparing to cross the street to the boarding house when a commotion erupted near the livery stable. A horse had broken free from its hitching post, spooked by something, and was now charging down the main thoroughfare with wild eyes and flailing hooves. People scattered, shouting warnings, and Grace pressed herself against the storefront wall. She watched as a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, wandered directly into the horse's path, oblivious to the danger while he chased after a rolling hoop. Grace's feet moved before her mind could intervene. She dropped her basket and ran into the street, her skirts hampering her stride. She reached the boy just as the horse bore down on them, and she shoved him hard toward the boardwalk. He tumbled to safety, but the momentum left Grace off balance. She felt herself falling, saw the horse's hooves rising above her, and in that frozen moment, she thought perhaps this was fitting. Perhaps this was how her story ended, trampled in the street while people watched. Then strong arms wrapped around her waist, and she was lifted clear off the ground. The world spun as someone carried her out of harm's way, moving with a speed and certainty that seemed impossible. She found herself deposited on the boardwalk, breathless and shaking, staring up at a man she had never seen before. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they studied her with genuine concern. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty denim and a faded blue shirt, with a worn Stetson now lying in the street where it had fallen during the rescue. "Are you hurt, miss?" His voice was deep and surprisingly gentle, with a slight drawl that suggested he hailed from somewhere further south. Grace scrambled to her feet, brushing dust from her skirt, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm fine." "That was a brave thing you did," he said, retrieving his hat. "Foolish, maybe, but brave. The child would have been killed." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, defensive. "And so would you have been if someone hadn't pulled you clear." He wasn't scolding her, just stating a fact. He extended his hand. "Name's Ryder Caldwell. I just hired on at the Morrison Ranch, out past Eagle Creek." Grace looked at his outstretched hand as if it might bite her. Physical contact with strangers was something she avoided, another wall she had built between herself and a world that had proven itself cruel. But refusing seemed churlish after he had just saved her life. She placed her hand in his briefly, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and long days in the saddle. "Grace Abbott." She pulled her hand back quickly. The boy's mother had rushed over, weeping and thanking Grace repeatedly, clutching her son as if she would never let him go. Grace accepted the gratitude with a stiff nod and turned to gather her scattered laundry. Ryder Caldwell helped without being asked, collecting the linens that had spilled from her basket when she dropped it. "You don't have to do that," Grace said. "I know." He handed her a carefully folded sheet. "But it seems only right, seeing as how we both ended up in the dirt on account of that horse." There was something in his tone, a lightness that wasn't mocking but almost playful, that confused her. Grace took the sheet and packed it away, avoiding his eyes. She could feel him watching her, and it made her skin prickle with discomfort. "Well, thank you for your assistance, Mr. Caldwell." She picked up her basket and prepared to leave. "Will you be at the church social on Sunday?" he asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. "Why would you ask that?" "Thought it might be nice to see a familiar face. I don't know many folks in town yet." His smile was easy, undemanding. "I don't attend social functions." Grace's voice was flat. "That's a shame. I hear the ladies make excellent pie." He settled his hat back on his head, seemingly unbothered by her coldness. "But I suppose I'll see you around town anyway. Independence doesn't seem big enough to avoid folks for long." He tipped his hat to her and walked away with the loose-limbed stride of a man comfortable in his own skin. Grace watched him go, feeling unsettled in a way she couldn't name. People didn't talk to her the way he just had, casual and friendly as if they were equals. People in this town either pitied her or looked through her as if she were invisible. This stranger had done neither, and she didn't know what to make of it. Over the following days, Grace found herself encountering Ryder Caldwell with surprising frequency. She saw him at the general store, purchasing supplies for the ranch. She passed him on the street as he led a string of horses to the blacksmith. Each time, he acknowledged her with a respectful nod or a quiet greeting. He never pushed for conversation, never intruded on her space, but his presence became a constant in the rhythm of her days. The Morrison Ranch was one of the largest cattle operations in the valley, and Will Morrison had a reputation as a fair employer who paid his men well. Grace knew this because she washed clothes for several of the ranch hands, including Morrison himself. It was grueling work, especially in the heat of late spring when the sun turned her little workspace behind the boarding house into an oven. She boiled water, scrubbed fabric against her washboard until her knuckles bled, wrung out heavy sheets and shirts, and hung everything to dry on lines stretched between two posts. Then she would collect the dry items, heat her irons on the stove, and press each piece until it was crisp and neat. It was during one of these long work days, when her back ached and sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, that Ryder Caldwell appeared in the alley behind the boarding house. Grace startled when she saw him, nearly dropping the iron she was holding. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said quickly, holding up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Mrs. Henderson said I could find you back here. I have some shirts that need washing." Grace set down the iron and wiped her hands on her apron, trying to compose herself. "You can leave them there." She pointed to a basket near the door. He deposited a bundle of clothing but made no move to leave. Instead, he watched her work for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "That looks like hard labor." "It's honest work," Grace replied, returning to her ironing. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." He leaned against the fence post, settling in as if he had nowhere else to be. "Just seems like a lot for one person to manage." "I manage fine." She kept her eyes on the shirt she was pressing, willing him to leave. His presence felt too large in the confined space, too intrusive on her carefully ordered solitude. "I'm sure you do." There was a pause. "The Morrison Ranch throws a summer roundup every year, big gathering with food and music. It's a few weeks away yet, but I thought maybe you might want to come out. Lots of folks from town attend." "I already told you, I don't attend social functions." Grace moved the iron with perhaps more force than necessary. "Why not?" The question was direct but not challenging. Grace looked up at him then, meeting those gray-blue eyes with her own guarded brown ones. "Because I have no interest in spending time with people who have shown me nothing but indifference or cruelty. Because I have learned that depending on others leads only to disappointment. Because I prefer my own company to the false friendship of people who would forget my name the moment I was no longer useful to them." "Is that sufficient explanation, Mr. Caldwell?" Most people would have retreated in the face of such hostility. Most people would have muttered an apology and fled. Ryder Caldwell simply nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he suspected. "That's a lonely way to live," he said quietly. "It's a safe way to live." Grace returned to her ironing, but her hands were trembling slightly. "Those two things aren't the same." He pushed off from the fence post. "But I won't press you. I'll pick up my shirts next week." He left, and Grace told herself she was relieved. She told herself she didn't notice how the alley seemed dimmer without his presence. She told herself she didn't wonder what he had meant about safety and loneliness not being the same thing. But that night, lying in her narrow bed in her cramped room, she found herself replaying the conversation. There had been no judgment in his voice when she spoke of her distrust. He hadn't tried to convince her she was wrong or tell her she was being too harsh. He had simply accepted her answer and left her in peace. It was such a small thing, but it lodged in her mind like a burr she couldn't dislodge. The next Sunday, Grace was hauling water from the pump when she saw a group of children teasing a skinny yellow dog. The animal was clearly a stray, ribs showing through its matted fur, and the children were throwing stones at it while it cowered against a building. Grace knew she should keep walking. She knew getting involved would only draw attention to herself. But something in the dog's terrified eyes called to her, a recognition of shared suffering. "Stop that," she said sharply, setting down her buckets. The children, ranging from about 8 to 12 years old, turned to look at her. The oldest boy, Marcus Prout, son of the town's most prosperous saloon owner, sneered. "It's just a mangy stray. Nobody wants it around. That doesn't give you the right to torment it." Grace stepped between the children and the dog. "You going to stop us?" Marcus picked up another stone. "My pa says you're nobody, says your father was a fool who died for nothing." The words hit like physical blows, but Grace kept her face impassive. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. "Go home." Marcus threw the stone anyway. Grace felt it graze her shoulder before clattering against the wall behind her. The dog yelped and tried to run, but it was limping badly. The children laughed and scattered, bored now that they had found a new target for their cruelty. Grace knelt beside the dog, moving slowly so as not to frighten it further. The animal watched her with wary eyes, growling low in its throat. She could see that its front paw was injured, possibly from a previous encounter with human malice. "It's all right," she murmured, though she knew the dog couldn't understand her words. "I won't hurt you." "He might hurt you, though. Looks half wild." Grace turned to find Ryder Caldwell approaching, carrying a bag of grain over his shoulder. She wondered how much he had witnessed. "He's injured and frightened," she said. "He needs help." Ryder set down his burden and crouched beside her, studying the dog with an expert eye. "Front leg's broken, looks like. Probably been like that for weeks. It's not healing right. Can anything be done?" Grace heard the concern in her own voice and was almost embarrassed by it. She shouldn't care about a stray dog. She shouldn't care about anything. Doc Morrison, Will's brother, has some veterinary training. He could set the leg properly, give it a chance to heal. Ryder met her eyes. "But someone would need to care for the dog while it recovers. Keep it still, make sure it eats, tend the wound. I don't have the space or the money to feed a dog." The words came automatically, the practical considerations that governed Grace's life. The ranch is always looking for good dogs once they're trained. Will would probably cover the expenses if he thought the animal would be useful later. Ryder reached out slowly, letting the dog sniff his hand. To Grace's surprise, the dog's growling subsided. "But like I said, someone would need to tend it for a few weeks." Grace looked at the dog, seeing the pain and fear in its eyes, seeing the expectation of further cruelty. She saw herself reflected in that gaze, and something in her chest tightened. "If Mr. Morrison will cover the costs, I can keep the dog," she heard herself say, "until it heals." Ryder's face broke into a smile, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his features entirely. "That's kind of you, Miss Abbott. Here, let me help you get him to Doc's office. He lives above the apothecary." Between the two of them, they managed to wrap the dog in Ryder's jacket and carry the frightened animal through town. People stared, and Grace heard the whispered comments. More proof of her strangeness, more fodder for gossip. But Ryder walked beside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world, speaking quietly to the dog, keeping his movements calm and reassuring. Doc Morrison was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He examined the dog thoroughly, explaining what he was doing in a low voice. The leg had indeed been broken and had begun to heal incorrectly. He would need to re-break it and set it properly. It would be painful for the animal, but it was the only way to save the leg. Grace held the dog's head while Doc Morrison worked, feeling the animal's trembling, whispering meaningless words of comfort. Ryder assisted with quiet competence, holding the leg steady while the doctor splinted it. Through it all, Grace felt tears pricking at her eyes, though whether for the dog or for herself she couldn't say. When it was done, Doc Morrison gave her detailed instructions for care. Keep the dog quiet. Make sure it didn't chew at the splint. Give it soft food and plenty of water. Return in 3 days so he could check the healing. "Thank you," Grace said quietly. "And the cost?" "I'll send the bill to Will," Doc Morrison replied with a wave of his hand. "Ryder here tells me this dog will make a fine cattle dog once he's healed. We'll call it an investment." Grace wasn't sure she believed that explanation, but she nodded gratefully. Ryder fashioned a lead from rope and led the dog outside, but the animal refused to walk, trying to pull toward Grace. "Looks like he's chosen you," Ryder observed. "I don't understand. I'm a stranger to him." "You showed him kindness when he expected cruelty. That means something." Ryder handed her the lead. Animals know who they can trust. Grace took the rope, looking down at the dog who was now leaning against her legs despite his injury. I should give him a name, I suppose. What about Chester? He looks like a Chester to me. Chester. Grace tried out the name, and the dog's tail gave a tentative wag. All right, Chester it is. Getting Chester to her room proved challenging, but the boarding house proprietor, Mrs. Henderson, grudgingly agreed to allow the dog as long as Grace kept it clean and quiet. Grace spread an old blanket on the floor for Chester to lie on and brought him water and some leftover stew from her own meager dinner. The dog ate ravenously, and she realized he had probably been starving for days. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Grace didn't fall asleep alone with her dark thoughts. Chester curled up on his blanket, and every time she stirred, she heard his tail thumping gently against the floor. Something about his presence eased the tightness in her chest just slightly, created a tiny crack in the walls she had built around her heart. Over the next few days, Grace found herself navigating an unfamiliar routine. She worked around Chester's needs, taking breaks from her washing to check on him, making sure he had food and water, talking to him even though she knew he couldn't understand. The dog watched her with devoted eyes, content to lie quietly as long as she was in sight. Ryder Caldwell stopped by every day, ostensibly to check on Chester's progress, but also bringing small gifts. A bone from the ranch kitchen for Chester, a jar of salve for Grace's chapped hands, a newspaper from San Francisco that someone at the ranch had finished reading. He never stayed long and never asked for anything in return, which made Grace deeply suspicious. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked on the 4th day when he appeared with a basket of food from the ranch cook. "Doing what?" Ryder looked genuinely confused. "Bringing me things." Checking on the dog, being, she struggled for the word. "Friendly." He set the basket down carefully. "Does there need to be a reason? In my experience, people always want something." Grace crossed her arms defensively. Ryder was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "What happened to you, Grace? What did they do that hurt you so badly?" The question, asked with such gentle sincerity, nearly undid her. She felt her throat tighten with emotion she had kept locked away for so long. "They killed my father and then forgot he existed. They took everything and left me with nothing. They proved that kindness is weakness and trust is foolishness. And so you decided to never trust anyone again. It wasn't a question. It's safer that way." But even as she said it, Grace felt the conviction wavering. Maybe. Ryder stepped closer, his voice dropping. "But you trusted me enough to help with Chester. You trusted Doc Morrison to set his leg. You trusted Mrs. Henderson not to throw you out for bringing in a stray. Trust isn't all or nothing, Grace. It's something you give in small pieces to people who earn it. And you think you've earned it." The challenge in her voice was automatic, protective. "I think I'd like the chance to try." He held her gaze. "I think you deserve to have someone in your life who won't let you down. Not because you need saving, but because everyone deserves that." Grace looked away first, overwhelmed by the intensity of his conviction. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be around people anymore without waiting for the betrayal." "Then we'll figure it out together. One day at a time, no pressure, no expectations." He picked up his hat, preparing to leave. "The roundup at the ranch is this Saturday. I'm asking again, will you come? Not for the people, but for the open air and the good food and maybe seeing Chester run around once his leg is healed enough. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. But I think you might enjoy getting out of this town for a few hours." Grace wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain her isolation, to stay safe behind her walls. But she looked at Chester, who had lifted his head at the sound of Ryder's voice, tail wagging. She thought about how Ryder had shown up every day, not with empty platitudes but with practical help. She thought about how he had listened to her anger without flinching, had accepted her boundaries without pushing. "I'll think about it," she heard herself say. Ryder's smile was like sunrise. "That's all I ask. I'll stop by Friday to see if you've decided." After he left, Grace sat on the floor beside Chester, running her hand over his fur. The dog licked her fingers, his dark eyes trusting and content. "What am I doing?" she whispered. "Why am I even considering this?" But she knew why. Because in the midst of her carefully constructed isolation, Ryder Caldwell had shown her something she had forgotten existed. Not pity, not charity, but simple human decency. He treated her as if she had value, as if her thoughts and feelings mattered, as if she were worthy of respect. And that small gift, offered freely with no strings attached, had begun to thaw the ice around her heart. Saturday arrived with cloudless blue skies and warm sunshine. Grace woke early, her stomach churning with anxiety. She had decided to go to the roundup, though she questioned the wisdom of that decision a dozen times. She dressed in her best dress, a pale green cotton that was 3 years old but still presentable, and braided her dark brown hair into a neat crown. Chester watched her preparations with interest, his tail thumping steadily. "I must be losing my mind," she told the dog, "going to a social gathering voluntarily." Chester's response was to limp over and lean against her leg, and Grace found herself smiling despite her nerves. Doc Morrison had been pleased with the leg's healing when she brought Chester in for his check. The dog would need another week of limited movement, but after that, he should be able to walk normally. Ryder arrived at 9 o'clock, driving a small wagon. He had cleaned up, wearing a pressed shirt and a string tie, his hair still damp from washing. He helped Grace into the wagon seat with easy courtesy, then loaded Chester carefully into the back on a pile of blankets. The ride to the Morrison Ranch took almost an hour, following a rutted road that wound through scrubland and past scattered stands of cottonwood trees. The Owens Valley spread out around them, vast and beautiful, with the Sierra Nevada rising dramatically to the west. Grace had forgotten how stunning this landscape was, how the mountains seemed to touch the sky, how the light changed the colors of the rocks and soil throughout the day. "It's beautiful out here," she said without thinking. "First time you've been outside town in a while." Ryder guided the horses around a deep rut. "I don't really go anywhere except where I need to for work." Grace realized how sad that sounded when spoken aloud. "Well, you're going somewhere today." He glanced at her with a slight smile. "And I promise if it gets overwhelming, I'll bring you right back. No questions asked." The reassurance helped, and Grace felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. They talked during the drive, or rather Ryder talked and Grace listened. He told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 16, about spending years drifting from job to job before landing in California. His life hadn't been easy, but he spoke without bitterness, finding humor in his struggles and lessons in his failures. "Why did you leave Texas?" Grace asked. "Too many memories. Too many people who knew me as the kid whose parents died, you know. I wanted to go somewhere I could be just Ryder, not the object of pity." He shot her a meaningful look. "I imagine you understand that feeling." "I do." Grace felt a flicker of connection, a recognition of shared experience. The Morrison Ranch was impressive, with a sprawling main house, several large barns, and extensive corrals. When they arrived, the roundup was already in full swing. Cowboys were demonstrating their skills, roping and riding for an audience of townspeople and neighboring ranchers. Long tables had been set up under a stand of oak trees, laden with food. Children ran everywhere, shrieking with laughter. A fiddle player was tuning up for dancing later. Grace felt immediately overwhelmed by the noise and activity. She gripped the edge of the wagon seat, fighting the urge to ask Ryder to turn around. "Hey." His voice was low and calm. "You're all right. We'll take it slow. Let's get Chester settled first, give you a chance to adjust." They found a shady spot away from the main activities and spread blankets for Chester. The dog seemed content to rest and watch the proceedings. Several ranch dogs approached to investigate, and Grace worried they might be aggressive, but Chester held his ground with quiet dignity, and the other dogs soon accepted his presence. Will Morrison himself came over to greet them. He was a big man with a weathered face and keen blue eyes. "Ryder tells me you've been nursing one of our future cattle dogs," he said to Grace with a warm smile. "I've been keeping him quiet while his leg heals," Grace replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Well, we appreciate it. Ryder says he's got good instincts. We'll give him a few months to recover fully, then start his training." Will squatted down to pet Chester. "He looks healthy. You've done well with him." Grace murmured something polite, uncomfortable with the praise. Will seemed to sense her discomfort and moved on, but his genuine kindness left an impression. This was Ryder's employer, a man of some standing in the community, and he had thanked her as if her contribution actually mattered. Ryder brought her a plate piled high with food: roasted beef, potato salad, cornbread, pickles, and 3 different kinds of pie. "The ranch cook, Miguel, is a genius. You have to try everything." Grace couldn't remember the last time she had eaten such rich food. She usually subsisted on simple fare, whatever was cheapest and easiest to prepare after long days of work. The flavors exploded on her tongue, and she found herself eating with genuine appetite, while Ryder told her stories about the various ranch hands, pointing them out and describing their quirks and talents. Several people from town were present, and Grace saw them looking her way, whispering behind their hands. She felt her old defenses rising, the familiar shame and anger. But Ryder seemed oblivious to the gossip, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He kept talking, his presence a buffer between her and the judgment of others. "Grace Abbott. Is that really you?" Grace looked up to see Sarah Mitchell, a woman she had known slightly before her father's death. Sarah had been kind to her in school, but they had drifted apart as adults. Now Sarah stood before her, holding a baby on her hip, her expression cautious but friendly. "Hello, Sarah." Grace set down her plate, bracing for whatever was coming. "I didn't expect to see you here. You never come to town events." Sarah shifted the baby to her other hip. "This is my daughter, Emma. I got married last year to David Mitchell. He works at the feed store. Congratulations." Grace wasn't sure what else to say. "I heard about what happened to you after your father passed." Sarah's voice dropped. "It wasn't right the way people treated you. I wanted to help, but David said we couldn't afford to get involved, and She trailed off, looking ashamed. "I should have tried harder. I'm sorry." The apology caught Grace completely off guard. She had spent 2 years believing everyone in town either hated her or had forgotten her entirely. The idea that someone had wanted to help but felt unable to do so was a new concept. "Thank you for saying that," Grace managed. "If you ever need anything or just want someone to talk to, I'm at the feed store most days." Sarah smiled tentatively. "I mean that. I know I failed you before, but I'd like to do better if you'll let me." After Sarah walked away, Grace sat in stunned silence. Ryder had politely excused himself during the conversation, giving them privacy, but now he returned with lemonade. "You all right?" he asked gently. "I think so. I assumed everyone felt the same way about me." Grace took the lemonade gratefully, using it to hide her confusion. People are complicated, Ryder said. Some are cruel because that's who they are. Some are thoughtless because they're wrapped up in their own troubles. And some are kind but don't always know how to show it. Figuring out which takes time. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple at all. It's messy and hard and you'll get it wrong sometimes. But the alternative is assuming everyone is terrible, and that's no way to live. He gestured toward Chester, who was sleeping peacefully in the shade. You didn't assume that dog was vicious even though he had every reason to be. You saw past his fear to what he could become. People deserve the same chance. Grace wanted to argue, but she couldn't find the words. Because he was right, in a way that made her chest ache. She had written off the entire world based on the actions of some, had imprisoned herself in isolation to stay safe. But safety without connection wasn't really living. It was just existing, and she was so tired of merely existing. The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease. Grace watched the demonstrations, impressed by the skill of the cowboys. Ryder was called to participate in a roping competition, and she found herself caught up in the excitement, cheering when he successfully lassoed a steer in record time. He returned flushed and grinning, and Grace realized she was smiling back, a real genuine smile that felt strange on her face. As the sun began to set, the fiddle music started in earnest, and couples began to dance. Grace watched from her spot beside Chester, content to observe. But Ryder extended his hand to her, his eyes asking a question. "I don't dance," Grace said automatically, "can't or won't." His tone was teasing but not pushing. "I haven't in years, I've forgotten how." "Then it's a good thing I'm patient." He kept his hand outstretched. "One dance. If you hate it, we'll stop. But I think you might surprise yourself." Grace looked at his hand, weathered and strong, offered without pressure or demand. She thought about everything that had happened today, the small moments of connection and kindness. She thought about Sarah's apology and Will Morrison's gratitude, and the way Ryder had stayed beside her all day, asking nothing but offering everything. She placed her hand in his and let him lead her to the dancing area. The song was a simple waltz, and Ryder proved to be a competent partner, guiding her through the steps with patience and good humor when she stumbled. Grace was intensely aware of his hand at her waist, the warmth of his palm against hers, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "See, you remember," he murmured as they found their rhythm. "I'm surprised you know how to dance. Most cowboys I've met can't tell a waltz from a polka." Grace was slightly breathless, from the exertion or from his proximity, she wasn't sure which. "My mother loved to dance. She taught me when I was young." There was fondness in his voice, a memory cherished rather than painful. "She said a gentleman should always know how to dance, even if he spends his days wrestling cattle." The song ended too soon, and Grace found herself reluctant to step out of Ryder's arms. They danced 2 more songs before she admitted she was tired. They returned to their spot by Chester, and Grace realized the day was nearly over. Part of her felt relieved, ready to retreat to her safe solitude. But a larger part felt disappointed, not ready for this strange, magical day to end. "Thank you for bringing me," she said quietly as they prepared to leave. "I didn't think I would enjoy it, but I did." "You're welcome." Ryder loaded Chester back into the wagon. "Maybe we could do something like this again." Not necessarily a big gathering, but getting out of town, spending time together. Grace felt panic flutter in her chest. This was happening too fast. She was letting him in too quickly, trusting too much, risking too much. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Why not?" He didn't sound offended, just curious. "Because I can't. I'm not ready for." She struggled to articulate the fear. "What if I start to trust you and you turn out to be like everyone else?" Ryder was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if you start to trust me and I turn out to be exactly who I seem to be? What if I keep showing up and being honest and treating you with respect? What if you let yourself believe that some people are actually trustworthy? That's terrifying." The admission escaped before she could stop it. "I know." His voice was soft with understanding. "But being alone forever is pretty terrifying too, isn't it?" Grace couldn't answer because the truth was too painful. Yes, it was terrifying. The loneliness was a constant ache, a hunger she couldn't satisfy. She had told herself she preferred it to the risk of betrayal, but that was becoming harder to believe. They rode back to Independence in comfortable silence, the stars emerging overhead in magnificent profusion. Chester slept in the back of the wagon, and Grace felt more at peace than she had in years. When Ryder helped her down in front of the boarding house, his hands lingered on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "Think about it," he said. "About spending more time together. No pressure. Just think about it." Grace took Chester inside, her mind whirling. She prepared for bed mechanically, but sleep eluded her. She kept replaying the day, the feel of Ryder's hand in hers, the way he had looked at her while they danced, the patience and kindness he had shown. He made her want things she had convinced herself were impossible. He made her hope, and hope was dangerous. But maybe, just maybe, it was also necessary. The next few weeks established a new pattern in Grace's life. Ryder came to town several times a week, always finding reasons to stop by. He brought Chester's medicine from Doc Morrison. He picked up supplies for the ranch at the general store where Grace happened to be shopping. He invited her on walks, on rides out to see the wildflowers blooming in the foothills, on picnics by Eagle Creek. Grace said yes more often than she said no, surprising herself. Each outing chipped away at her defenses, revealed more of the man beneath the cowboy exterior. Ryder was thoughtful and funny, hard-working and honest. He told her about his dreams of eventually owning his own small ranch. Nothing fancy, but something that was his. He talked about the satisfaction of working with horses, the peace he found in the vast, empty landscapes. He listened when she talked about her father, about the store they had run together, about her shattered dreams of taking over the business someday. "You could still do that," he said one afternoon as they sat beside the creek, watching Chester splash in the shallow water. The dog's leg had healed beautifully, and he ran with barely a trace of a limp now. "Do what?" Grace trailed her fingers in the cool water. "Run a store, start a business. You're smart and you work hard, there's nothing stopping you. Except I have no money, no credit, and a reputation as the girl whose father died in debt." Grace tried to keep the bitterness from her voice but didn't quite succeed. "So you start small. Sewing, maybe. You could take in more complicated work, make dresses for the ladies in town. Build up a clientele, save money, eventually open a dress shop." He spoke as if this were completely reasonable, completely possible. That would take years. But even as she protested, Grace felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Most worthwhile things do. Ryder turned to look at her, his gray-blue eyes intense. "You're 19 years old, Grace. You have your whole life ahead of you. You can spend it being a victim of what happened, or you can build something new. The choice is yours." No one had ever suggested she had choices before. Everyone had treated her situation as fixed, permanent, a tragedy to be endured. But Ryder spoke as if her future was still unwritten, as if she had agency and power. It was a radical idea, frightening but also electrifying. "I wouldn't know where to start," she admitted. "Start by saying yes. Say yes to the possibility. Everything else will follow." He reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. The gesture felt natural now, comfortable. Grace looked at their joined hands, marveling at how much had changed. 6 weeks ago, she had flinched from human touch. Now she craved Ryder's presence, looked forward to the moments when he would reach for her hand or brush a stray hair from her face. He had been so careful with her, so patient, letting her set the pace of their growing relationship. Because it was a relationship now, though they hadn't defined it with words. Grace knew that Ryder cared for her as more than a friend. She saw it in the way he looked at her, in the way he always made sure she was comfortable and happy, in the small, thoughtful gestures that marked his attention. And she was beginning to acknowledge, at least to herself, that she cared for him too. The feelings terrified her, left her feeling vulnerable and exposed, but she couldn't deny them. "What do you want from me?" The question came out of nowhere, startling them both. "I mean, why are you doing all this? Why do you care so much?" Ryder didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the water, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "At first, I just saw someone who needed help, someone who had been hurt and was struggling. I wanted to help because it was the right thing to do, but then I got to know you and everything changed." He turned to face her fully. "You're strong, Grace, stronger than you give yourself credit for. You survived something that would have broken most people, and you kept going. You're smart and capable, and when you let your guard down, you're funny and kind. I care about you because of who you are, not because I pity you or want something from you. I care because I can't seem to help it." Grace felt tears welling up, and she blinked them back furiously. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone care about me. You're already doing it." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "Every time you let me hold your hand or share a meal with me or tell me about your day, you're letting me in. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. But what if it doesn't last? What if something happens and you leave or change your mind or realize I'm not worth the effort?" The fear poured out, raw and honest. "Then we'll deal with it if it happens." "But I'm not planning on going anywhere, Grace. I'm not planning on changing my mind, and you are absolutely worth every bit of effort." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know you've been hurt. I know people have let you down, but I'm asking you to take a chance on me, on us. I think we could have something really special if you're willing to try." Grace wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to throw caution aside and leap into whatever he was offering. But the old fears held her back, whispered warnings in her mind. "Can I have some time to think about it?" "Of course." Ryder smiled, no trace of disappointment in his face. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." They stayed by the creek until the sun began to sink toward the mountains, talking about easier subjects. But Grace's mind churned with Ryder's words, with the possibility he represented. She thought about what he had said about starting a dressmaking business, about building a new life. She thought about the way her heart felt lighter when he was around, how the world seemed less gray and cold. That night, Grace took out her small store of savings, money she had hoarded over 2 years of relentless work. It wasn't much, perhaps $60 total, but it was something. She thought about what it would take to set herself up as a seamstress properly. She would need better fabric, more thread, new needles and scissors. She would need to advertise her services somehow, convince the town's ladies that she could create fashionable dresses despite her circumstances. It seemed impossible. But then again, 6 weeks ago, the idea of trusting anyone seemed impossible, and yet here she was, seriously considering opening her heart to Ryder Caldwell. The next morning, Grace did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She went to church. She sat in the back pew, feeling exposed and uncomfortable under the curious stares of other parishioners. She hadn't prayed since her father's death, had felt abandoned by a God who would allow such cruelty. But now, sitting in the quiet sanctuary, she found herself reaching out tentatively. She didn't know what she was praying for exactly. Courage, maybe. Wisdom. The ability to trust again. A sign that taking a risk on Ryder was the right choice. She sat through the service in a daze, not really hearing the sermon, just letting the familiar rhythms wash over her. As she was leaving, Sarah Mitchell caught up with her. "Grace, I'm so glad to see you here. Would you like to come to our house for Sunday dinner? Nothing fancy, just David and Emma and me, but we'd love to have you." 6 weeks ago, Grace would have refused automatically. But now she found herself saying, "That would be nice. Thank you." The dinner was simple but delicious, and David proved to be a quiet, thoughtful man who treated his wife with obvious affection. They asked Grace about her work, and she found herself telling them about Ryder's suggestion that she expand into dressmaking. To her surprise, Sarah was enthusiastic. "You made the most beautiful dress for the May festival 3 years ago, remember? That blue one with the lace. I wanted one just like it." Sarah bounced Emma on her knee. "I bet lots of ladies in town would pay good money for custom dresses, especially if you could make them for less than ordering from San Francisco." "I don't know if anyone would trust me with the work," Grace said doubtfully. "They would if you had some examples to show them." David spoke up for the first time. "Sarah needs a new Sunday dress. Why don't we commission you to make it? That way you'd have a sample of your work to display." Grace was overwhelmed by their kindness, by the practical help they offered without condescension or pity. She agreed to make Sarah's dress, and they spent the rest of the afternoon discussing fabrics and styles. By the time Grace left, she had measurements, a design sketch, and a deposit of $10. She walked back to the boarding house in a daze, clutching the money as if it might disappear. She was beginning to see what Ryder had been telling her. Not everyone was cruel. Some people were thoughtless or careless, and some had their own troubles that prevented them from helping others. But some people were genuinely kind, genuinely wanted to help, if only they knew how. She had been so wrapped up in her pain that she had stopped giving anyone a chance to prove themselves. When Ryder came by on Tuesday, Grace was ready with her answer. She invited him to walk with her in Chester, and they headed out toward the edge of town where the landscape opened up into scrubland. "I've been thinking about what you said," Grace began, her heart hammering. "About taking chances and building a new life. And—" Ryder's voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "And I want to try. I want to try building a business, and I want to try." She took a deep breath. "I want to try seeing where this goes between us. I'm still scared. I'm probably going to panic and pull away sometimes. But I care about you, Ryder. More than I thought I could care about anyone. And you've shown me that not everyone is cruel, that some people keep their promises and treat others with respect. You've given me my hope back, and I don't know how to thank you for that." Ryder stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression a mix of joy and relief. "You don't have to thank me. You did this yourself, Grace. You chose to take the risk. You chose to start trusting again. I just gave you a reason to try. You gave me more than that." Grace stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You gave me the courage to hope again." He reached up and cupped her face gently, his calloused thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Can I kiss you?" Grace's breath caught. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Ryder leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. His lips met hers softly, tentatively, a question more than a demand. Grace felt her eyes close, felt herself leaning into the kiss, into him. It was sweet and gentle and perfect, nothing like the harsh, conquering kisses she had imagined. It was a promise, a beginning, a declaration of hope. When they broke apart, Grace was trembling. Ryder rested his forehead against hers, his hand still framing her face. "I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I thought you should know." I think I'm falling in love with you too." The words felt foreign but true. "It scares me. It scares me too," he smiled. "But I think the best things usually do." They walked back to town hand in hand, Chester trotting beside them. Grace felt as if the world had shifted, as if she were seeing everything through new eyes. The town that had seemed so hostile now looked just neutral, just a place like any other. The people she had written off as enemies now appeared as individuals with their own struggles and stories. She had been so focused on her own pain that she had stopped seeing the complexity of life around her. Over the following weeks, Grace threw herself into her new venture. She completed Sarah's dress, which turned out beautifully, and Sarah wore it to church with pride, telling everyone who asked that Grace Abbott had made it. 3 more commissions followed, then 5, then 8. Grace found herself working longer hours than ever, but now the work felt purposeful rather than merely exhausting. She was building something, creating a future. Ryder was there through all of it, offering support and encouragement. He helped her set up a proper workspace in a small rented room that had better light than her tiny bedroom. He spread word about her business at the ranch, and soon she was making shirts and mending clothes for ranch hands at good prices. The money began to accumulate, slowly but steadily. Their relationship deepened as well. They spent as much time together as their work allowed, learning each other's habits and quirks. Grace discovered that Ryder sang to himself while he worked, that he had a sweet tooth for peppermint candy, that he wrote letters to an elderly aunt in Texas every week without fail. Ryder learned that Grace was ticklish behind her left ear, that she loved thunderstorms, that she could identify any wildflower in the region. They talked about their future carefully, tentatively. Ryder wanted to own land someday, and Grace wanted to expand her business into a full dress shop. They spoke of these dreams separately at first, but gradually the conversations shifted to include both of them. When we have our own place became when we save enough money. The future transformed from individual to shared. In August, a fire broke out at the feed store where David Mitchell worked. Grace heard the alarm bells and ran to see what had happened, her heart in her throat. The fire was already out of control when she arrived, flames leaping from the roof, thick smoke pouring into the street. People were forming bucket brigades, but it was clear the building was a loss. Then she heard Sarah's voice screaming David's name. Grace pushed through the crowd and found Sarah being restrained by 2 men, Emma wailing in her arms. "He's still inside. He went back for the account books." Without thinking, Grace thrust Emma into the arms of a nearby woman and ran toward the burning building. Someone shouted at her to stop, but she ignored them. She ducked low, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve, and plunged into the smoke-filled interior. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke choking. Grace could barely see, could barely breathe. She called David's name, straining to hear a response over the roar of the flames. She was about to retreat when she heard a weak cough from near the back office. She found David crumpled on the floor, overcome by smoke, the account books clutched in his hands. Grace grabbed his arm and pulled, but he was too heavy for her to lift alone. She was starting to panic, to realize she had made a terrible mistake, when another figure appeared through the smoke. Ryder. Of course it was Ryder. He lifted David effortlessly and headed for the door, Grace stumbling behind them. They burst out into the street just as a section of the roof collapsed behind them, sending sparks and embers flying. Willing hands pulled them to safety, and Doc Morrison rushed over to tend to David. Grace collapsed on the ground, coughing and gasping, her lungs burning. Ryder knelt beside her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes fierce with emotion. "Don't you ever do something that foolish again," he said, his voice rough. "I almost lost you in there. I had to help." Grace's voice was a rasp. "Sarah needed him, Emma needed him, and I need you." Ryder pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "God, Grace, when I saw you run into that building, my heart stopped. Promise me you'll never do that again." "I can't promise that." Grace clung to him, still shaking from adrenaline and fear. "I can't promise I won't help people who need it. That's not who I want to be." Ryder pulled back to look at her, and despite his obvious fear and anger, he was smiling. "You're absolutely remarkable, do you know that? Terrifying but remarkable." David recovered quickly, thanks to Doc Morrison's treatment and Sarah's frantic nursing. He and Sarah both thanked Grace profusely, insisted she had saved David's life. Grace deflected the praise, but privately she felt something shift inside her. For 2 years, she had believed herself powerless, a victim of circumstances she couldn't control. But running into that burning building, she had chosen to act rather than to hide. She had chosen to risk herself for someone else's benefit. She had reclaimed her agency. A week later, Ryder took her on a long ride out to a piece of land several miles from town. It was beautiful property, a stretch of valley with a creek running through it, cottonwood trees providing shade, and a view of the mountains that took Grace's breath away. "I've been talking to Will Morrison," Ryder said as they sat on a flat rock beside the creek. "He's willing to sell me this parcel at a fair price. It's not huge, maybe 80 acres, but it's enough for a small ranch. Good water, decent grazing. I could build a house here, start a horse breeding operation." Grace looked around, imagining the possibilities. "It's perfect, Ryder." "I think so too." He took her hand. "I have enough saved for a down payment, and Will is willing to carry the note for the rest. I could start building in the fall, have a house ready by spring." "That's wonderful." Grace was genuinely happy for him, even though the thought of him moving out of town made her heart ache. "It could be wonderful for both of us." Ryder turned to face her, his expression serious. "Grace, I know we've only known each other a few months. I know you're still building your business and your life. But I can't imagine my future without you in it. I want to build that house for us. I want you to be my wife." Grace felt the world tilt. This was happening too fast, wasn't it? They had only been courting since June. It was only August. People would talk, would say she was desperate or foolish. But when she looked into Ryder's eyes, she saw her whole future spread out before her. A life of partnership and respect, of love and laughter. A life where she wasn't alone anymore, where she had someone who would stand beside her through whatever came. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ryder's whoop of joy startled Chester, who had been dozing in the shade. He pulled Grace to her feet and spun her in a circle, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Grace felt all her remaining fears and doubts melting away. This was right. This was what she wanted. They announced their engagement the following Sunday at church, and the reaction was mixed but mostly positive. Some people were happy for them, offering genuine congratulations. Others clearly thought Grace was rushing into things or that Ryder was making a mistake. Grace found she didn't care what the skeptics thought. She had spent too long letting others' opinions dictate her choices. The wedding was set for October, giving them time to prepare. Grace threw herself into sewing her wedding dress, something simple but elegant in cream-colored silk that Sarah helped her find in Sacramento. Ryder worked with a crew from the ranch to begin construction on their house, and Grace rode out every weekend to see the progress. She watched the walls go up, the roof take shape, the windows installed. She helped choose where the kitchen would be, where her sewing room would go, where they would eventually build a barn. Sarah and David became close friends, helping with wedding preparations and offering advice on married life. Will Morrison donated cattle for a wedding feast. Doc Morrison offered to perform the ceremony. Grace discovered that the town of Independence wasn't the hostile place she had imagined. There were cruel people, yes, but there were also kind ones, thoughtless ones, and ones who simply went about their business without malice or charity. It was just a town, full of complicated human beings trying their best. The morning of her wedding, Grace stood in her room at the boarding house, looking at her reflection in the small mirror. The cream silk dress fit perfectly, and Sarah had woven wildflowers into her braided hair. She looked happy, she realized. The hard, brittle edge that had defined her for 2 years was gone, replaced by something softer but stronger. There was a knock on the door, and Sarah entered, beautiful in a blue dress Grace had made for her. "Are you ready?" "I am." Grace picked up her small bouquet of wildflowers. "Sarah, can I ask you something? How did you know David was the right person? How did you trust enough to marry him?" Sarah smiled. "I realized that not trusting was making me miserable, so I decided to take a chance on someone who had never given me a reason not to trust them." "Ryder's never given you a reason to doubt him, has he?" "No." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. "He's been nothing but kind and patient and honest." "Then trust that. Trust him. Trust yourself." Sarah hugged her carefully, mindful of the dress. "You deserve to be happy, Grace. Don't let the fear of what might happen keep you from enjoying what is happening." The ceremony took place at the new house, which wasn't quite finished but was far enough along to accommodate the guests. Grace arrived to find dozens of people gathered, more than she expected. Ranch hands from Morrison spread. Townspeople she knew slightly, Sarah and David and Emma, Will Morrison and his family. Even Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had come, looking pleased with herself for introducing Grace to the town's most eligible bachelor. And there was Ryder, standing beneath an arch decorated with fall leaves and wild roses, wearing a new suit and looking more handsome than Grace had ever seen him. When their eyes met, his whole face lit up, and Grace felt her heart expand with love so intense it was almost painful. Doc Morrison performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, speaking about the importance of partnership and respect, about choosing to love someone every day. When it came time for the vows, Grace spoke hers clearly, no trembling or hesitation. She promised to be faithful and true, to support Ryder in his dreams, to build a life together based on honesty and trust. Ryder's voice was thick with emotion when he made his promises. "I vow to respect you and cherish you, to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me, to show you every day that love is real and good people exist. I promise to be your partner in all things, to lift you up when you fall, and to celebrate your triumphs as if they were my own." When Doc Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Ryder kissed her as if they were the only two people in the world. The gathered guests cheered, and Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy. The celebration lasted well into the evening. Miguel from the ranch had outdone himself with the food, and the fiddle player from the roundup provided music for dancing. Grace danced with Ryder, with Will Morrison, with David Mitchell. She accepted congratulations from people who had ignored her for 2 years, and she found she could do so without bitterness. They hadn't known how to help her before, but they were showing up now, and that was enough. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Ryder took Grace's hand and led her into their new house. It wasn't fully furnished yet, but they had a bed and a small table and a stove. It was enough to start their life together. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Caldwell?" Ryder asked, pulling her into his arms. Grace tested out her new name silently, feeling how it fit. "I feel happy, terrified but happy. Good terrified or bad terrified. His hand settled on her waist, familiar and comforting. Good, terrified. The kind that comes from knowing your life is about to change completely and trusting that the change will be worth it. She laid her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me that not everyone is cruel. Thank you for giving me a chance to prove it. He kissed the top of her head. I love you, Grace. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that. They stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other, and Grace felt the last of her walls crumble. She was vulnerable now, open to hurt, but she was also open to love and joy and all the beautiful, complicated messiness of human connection. It was worth the risk. Ryder was worth the risk. Their first year of marriage was a time of hard work and steady growth. Ryder established his horse breeding operation, starting small with 3 mares and a good stud horse he purchased from a ranch in Nevada. Grace continued her dressmaking business, converting one room of their house into a proper shop. She traveled to town twice a week to meet with clients and deliver finished garments, and her reputation grew steadily. By the following spring, she had more work than she could handle alone and was considering taking on an apprentice. They settled into the rhythms of married life, learning to navigate disagreements and compromise. Ryder tended to be overly optimistic, taking on more projects than he could reasonably finish. Grace was still sometimes suspicious of people's motives, seeing cruelty where there was only thoughtlessness. But they learned to balance each other, to call out each other's blind spots gently, to apologize when they were wrong. Chester adapted to ranch life beautifully, proving to be an excellent cattle dog just as Will Morrison had predicted. He remained devoted to Grace, following her around the property whenever she was outside, sleeping at the foot of their bed every night. Ryder teased her about being a one-woman dog, but Grace knew he loved Chester as much as she did. In the spring of 1879, Sarah gave birth to a second child, a boy they named Michael. Grace was there for the birth, holding Sarah's hand and encouraging her through the difficult labor. Afterward, holding tiny Michael in her arms, Grace felt a longing she hadn't expected. She and Ryder had talked about children in abstract terms, someday in the future, but now that future felt urgent and immediate. "You want a baby?" she asked Ryder that night as they prepared for bed. He looked up from the book he was reading, surprise and hope warring on his face. "I do, but only if you're ready. I know building your business is important to you." "It is important." Grace sat beside him on the bed. "But you're important too. Our family is important. I think I'm ready to try." Ryder set aside his book and pulled her into his arms. "Then let's try. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Grace became pregnant in early summer. The pregnancy was easier than she expected, though she tired more quickly and found herself unable to tolerate the smell of certain foods. Ryder was attentive and patient, taking over more of the household chores and hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier laundry. Grace continued her sewing as long as she could, finally stopping when she could no longer sit comfortably at her machine for extended periods. Their son was born in February of 1880, during a rare snowstorm that blanketed the valley in white. Doc Morrison made it to their ranch just in time, and Grace labored through the night with Ryder holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. When she finally heard her baby's first cry, she wept with relief and overwhelming love. They named him Thomas Ryder Caldwell, after Grace's father and his own. Thomas was a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes. Ryder was besotted from the first moment, holding his son with wonder and awe. "He's perfect," Ryder whispered, rocking Thomas gently. "You're perfect. Our family is perfect." Grace watched her husband with their baby and felt her heart overflow. This was the life she had never dared to dream of, the happiness she thought had been stolen from her forever. She had been so wrong about so many things. Wrong to believe all people were cruel. Wrong to think trust was weakness. Wrong to give up on hope. "I was so broken when you found me," she said softly. "I didn't think I could ever feel whole again." Ryder looked up, his eyes shining with emotion. "You were never broken, Grace. You were hurt, but you were always strong. You just needed someone to remind you. You did more than remind me. You showed me what love actually looks like. Not pretty words or empty promises, but showing up every day and choosing kindness even when it's hard." Grace reached out to touch Thomas's tiny hand. "You showed me that not everyone is cruel, and because of that, I get to have this. All of this." The years that followed were filled with the usual joys and challenges of building a life together. The horse ranch prospered, and Ryder's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled horseman spread throughout the region. Grace's dressmaking business evolved into a thriving enterprise, and she eventually partnered with a seamstress from Sacramento to open a small shop in Independence. They hired 2 young women as apprentices, and Grace found deep satisfaction in teaching her skills to the next generation. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Rose in 1882 and another son, Henry, in 1885. Their house expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Ryder adding rooms and a proper barn. The property bloomed with Grace's gardens, flowers and vegetables that she tended with the same care she gave to everything in her life. Grace maintained her friendship with Sarah and David, and their children grew up together, running wild across the valley. She reconciled with some of the townspeople who had failed her after her father's death, understanding now that fear and self-preservation had motivated many of them, not malice. She learned to distinguish between those who were genuinely cruel and those who were simply flawed humans doing their best. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder took Grace back to the spot where he had proposed, the flat rock beside the creek. The land looked different now, with fences and buildings, horses grazing peacefully in the fields. But the view of the mountains was the same, and the sound of the water was as soothing as ever. "You remember what you said when I proposed?" Ryder asked, holding her hand. "I said yes." Grace smiled at the memory. "Best decision I ever made. You also said you were scared. Are you still scared?" His tone was teasing, but she heard the genuine question beneath. Grace considered carefully. "Sometimes. I'm scared something will happen to you or the children. I'm scared we'll lose everything we've built. But I'm not scared of trusting you anymore. I'm not scared of love. You taught me that love is worth the risk, that opening your heart doesn't make you weak. You taught me a few things too." Ryder pulled her close. "You taught me that healing takes time, that patience is a form of love, that believing in someone can help them believe in themselves." They stood together, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Grace thought about the girl she had been 10 years ago, so full of anger and fear, convinced that the world was uniformly cruel. That girl would never have believed this life was possible. But Ryder had shown her different, had proved through consistent action that good people existed, that trust could be earned and kept, that love was real and powerful and worth fighting for. Thomas was 12 now, already helping his father with the horses and showing a natural aptitude for the work. Rose was a bright-spirited 8-year-old who loved to read and had declared she wanted to be a doctor like Doc Morrison. Henry was still a baby, but his personality was already emerging, cheerful and curious about everything. Grace looked at her children and saw the future, saw all the possibilities that had opened up because one cowboy had refused to give up on a broken girl. "What are you thinking about?" Ryder asked, noticing her smile. I'm thinking about how lucky I am, how different my life could have been if you hadn't shown me kindness that day in the street." Grace leaned into him. "I'm thinking about how you saved me in more ways than just pulling me away from that horse." "We saved each other," Ryder corrected gently. "You gave me a purpose, a family, a reason to put down roots. You made me believe I could be more than just a drifting cowboy." They rode back to their ranch as the stars began to emerge, and Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her faith in humanity had been shattered by cruel people, by violence and betrayal and indifference. But Ryder had shown her that cruelty was not universal, that kindness existed, that people could be trusted if you gave them the chance to prove themselves worthy. He had been patient when she needed patience, strong when she needed strength, and loving when she needed love most. Their marriage had not been perfect. They had disagreed about money and priorities and parenting. They had faced droughts and illnesses and difficult times. But they had faced everything together, as partners, and that had made all the difference. Grace had learned that love was not the naive trust of her youth, believing everyone was good. It was the mature understanding that some people were trustworthy and worth the risk, and having the courage to open your heart to those people despite past hurts. As she tucked her children into bed that night, kissing each sleepy face, Grace marveled at the life she had built from the ruins of her old one. She thought about her father, who had believed in the goodness of people and paid for that belief with his life. She understood now that he hadn't been a fool. He had simply been unlucky, encountering the wrong people at the wrong time. But his faith in humanity had been passed down to her, dormant but not dead, waiting for someone like Ryder to revive it. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of ordinary moments and extraordinary milestones. Thomas grew into a fine young man, taking over more responsibility for the horse operation as Ryder's back began to trouble him. Rose did indeed pursue medicine, studying with Doc Morrison and eventually attending medical school in San Francisco, the first woman from Independence to do so. Henry proved to have a head for business, and he helped expand Grace's dress shop into a general mercantile that served the growing community. Grace and Ryder grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with the marks of years spent in sun and wind. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming something rich and complex, woven through with shared memories and survived challenges and mutual respect. They still held hands when they walked. They still danced in their kitchen when the mood struck them. They still looked at each other with the wonder of people who know how lucky they are. On a warm spring evening in 1910, Grace sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset with Ryder beside her. They were both in their 50s now, still active but slower than they once were. Their grandchildren played in the yard, Thomas's 3 boys and Rose's daughter. Henry, who had married the previous year, was bringing his new wife to visit the following weekend. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, gesturing to the scene before them. "All those years ago when we first met, did you imagine we'd build all this?" Ryder thought about it. "I imagined something, but the reality is better than anything I could have dreamed up. You exceeded every expectation, Grace. You always have. We did this together." She laced her fingers through his, the gesture as natural as breathing after 32 years. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." "Sure you could have. You're the strongest person I know." Ryder lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "But I'm glad you didn't have to do it alone. I'm glad you let me walk beside you." Grace thought about the girl she had been in 1878, standing outside the general store in Independence, her heart encased in ice, her faith in humanity shattered. She thought about how Ryder had approached her with simple kindness, asking nothing, offering everything. She thought about how slowly, carefully, patiently he had shown her that not everyone was cruel, that trust could be rebuilt, that love was worth the risk. "You changed my life," she said quietly. "You gave me back my ability to hope and dream and believe in good things. You changed mine too." Ryder's voice was equally soft. "You taught me that love isn't just about the easy moments. It's about showing up when things are hard, about being patient when someone needs time to heal, about believing in someone even when they don't believe in themselves." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Their grandchildren were called inside by their parents, and the ranch grew quiet except for the sounds of horses moving in the barn and the creek flowing in the distance. Grace felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she had thought was impossible. This contentment, this family, this love. She had been so certain that the world was uniformly cruel, that everyone would disappoint her, that trusting anyone was foolish. But Ryder had proved her wrong in the best possible way. He had shown her through consistent action over decades that some people kept their promises, that some love lasted, that faith in humanity could be restored one kind act at a time. "Thank you," Grace whispered, though she knew the words were inadequate for what she felt. "For what?" Ryder asked, though his smile suggested he knew. "For not giving up on me, for seeing past my walls to the person underneath, for proving that my father was right about people, that there is goodness in the world if you're brave enough to look for it." She turned to face him fully. "For loving me when I didn't know how to love myself." Ryder cupped her face in his weathered hands, the same hands that had pulled her from danger all those years ago. "Loving you has been the easiest and best thing I've ever done. You never needed fixing, Grace. You just needed someone to stand beside you while you healed yourself." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that contained 3 decades of partnership and devotion. Grace kissed him back, pouring all her gratitude and love into the gesture. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her head on his shoulder, and they watched the stars emerge one by one. Her faith had been shattered by cruel people, by violence and betrayal and indifference. But this cowboy had shown her that not everyone was cruel, that kindness existed, that the world still held beauty and goodness if you were willing to risk your heart to find it. He had taught her that trust was not weakness but courage, that opening yourself to love was the bravest thing a person could do. And because of him, because of his patient, steady devotion, Grace had built a life beyond anything she could have imagined. A life filled with love and family and purpose. A life that honored her father's belief in human goodness while acknowledging the reality of human cruelty. A life that balanced caution with hope, protection with vulnerability, wisdom with faith. As they sat together under the vast starlit sky, Grace Abbott Caldwell knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. The broken girl who had stood outside that general store was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that healing was possible, that love was real, and that sometimes, if you were very lucky, the right person came along at exactly the right moment to show you that not everyone was cruel, and the world still held magic enough for second chances and happy endings.